it's a real, as I said, it's a real privilege to be with you guys. And you have, it must be very strange for you folks too, the way things have started off for university, especially some of you first years. And I appreciate just how difficult that is. As I say, 4 of my offspring are children. 2 of them are married. One's in Egypt teaching internationally, and one's still at home. She's a music teacher. And I've been watching her, in particular, doing all her Zoom lessons and preparing all that. It's just nuts. And well, you probably are the same. You're up to dinner what time at night, every night. Like if you think anybody looks at teaching and thinks it's a 9 to 3 and you go home and that's it, and big long holidays, they have no idea. And I know you're not all teachers, and other of you are doing other degrees as well. So thank you again for making me part of this. I'm going to read then from Genesis chapter 4, and read the first 16 verses. And it's this account of Cain and Abel. So we'll begin at chapter 4, verse 1. Adam lay with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now, Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, but Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not also be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out into the field." And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth." Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you're driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. There's an awful lot of stuff in that reading, a lot of questions. We could spend a lot of time looking at that. What I'm going to do is pick out a couple of wee things that I hope and pray that will be helpful for you folks, and you'll see lots of things that I'm sort of missing, but we'll start off at the very beginning. You remember after the fall, Eve was deceived, but Adam, he walked in eyes wide open into sin. So he was really, if you like, more guilty. But you remember that there was promises and curses that came, and Eve was promised that she would give birth to a child, a son, and that son would crush the head of that old deceiving serpent. So there would be a comeuppance for Satan, and that promised person, that promised Messiah, would crush Satan's head in the final battle. So whenever, bear in mind, nobody ever had a baby before, so it must have been quite unusual for Eve to suddenly have a baby. Oh, goodness. And then what would she name him? Well, she and Adam named him Cain. That's significant because Cain means I've got him, or here he is. And I think it's pretty evident that Eve, in her faith, she had been faithfully waiting for what God had promised, which was this son who would crush the head of Satan. And she has a son. So it's not unlikely that she thought, by naming him Cain, here he is, or I've gotten him. that she thought she had the promise. And holding that little baby in her arms, Eve would have had no idea that he would grow up to be the murderer of her next child, that he would murder his own brother. And I just wonder about that. As Eve went through her life and as her family disintegrated into murder, and I wonder where her faith was. The faith that God would give her a son who would crush Satan's head, that seemed to be so pregnant, if you don't mind the simile, pregnant with expectation, and then he arrives, and then it turns out she's disappointed, and he turns out to be something very different. You know, as you go through your Christian lives, you know times of great joy, and you will know times of great blessing, and God will lift your hearts, and God will bring to you tremendous times of reassurance and faith and answer your prayers. But there will also be times when God seems further away and the things you'd hoped for don't come to be. You remember in the last chapter of Luke, the Lord has been crucified and it's the third day. And two of his disciples are walking, chatting to one another very despondently about what's just happened. They're going to a wee village about 7 miles outside Jerusalem. It's called Emmaus. And as they're walking along, a stranger comes alongside them. And he says, "What are you talking about as you're walking along?" And they sort of look at this stranger and say, "Where have you been?" I mean, the only thing that anybody's actually talking about. And then they explain how that they had followed Jesus and how that he had been put to death and crucified on the cross. And one of the wee phrases they use as such tremendous pathos is this. They say, "We had hoped he was the one to rescue Israel. We had hoped." And you sense these two disciples walking along the third day after Jesus' death, and they're talking about this, and then they explain that we had really hoped, you know, that we give up our careers and our lives, and we followed him, and we saw him do amazing things. We saw him feed thousands of people from nothing. We saw him walk on water. We saw him deal with the most difficult questions. The authority that he had, the way he spoke, you've never... And we had really hoped. But now, it's such a sad little phrase, isn't it? And sometimes life will throw disappointments at us. I remember my first disappointment, my first attack on hope, if you like. And I was a young boy, and growing up in Grey Abbey in the Irish Peninsula, which is only 3 miles from where I now live. And there was traveling preachers who did children's meetings, and they came to the Orange Hall in Grey Abbey, and I went across with my sister, and we were there. And at the end of each service, each time, you would get a prize for the best boy or best girl, you know. So that night came around whenever the children's speaker turned around and he looked at me with a Milky Way in his hand. I was about 6.5 years old. And he had this Milky Way, and he said, "And now for the best behaved child on this side of the room." And the Milky Way came towards me, and I put my hand out, and here came the Milky Way, and it bypassed me and went to the person beside me. And as if that wasn't bad enough, it was actually my sister. So I had no hope of getting any part of that Milky Way. And I remember, I can still feel that today. I can still remember putting my hand out, and then taking it back, and then doing it a few more times, just in case he thought, you know, to try and cover up for my embarrassment. And I still feel the crushing of that, the crushing of hope. I remember too, when my wife and I were about a year and a half married, and we were just beginning to expect our first child, and we were all excited about that. And then one day I was in work, and I got a call from my wife who was rushing to hospital. And by the time we got there, of course, as you've probably guessed, we lost the wee baby. And the incredible disappointment that was behind all that hope and expectation and prayers and faith and trust. And sometimes life will do that. Sometimes it won't just be days of sun and sunshine, and fellowship and joy. There will be days when what we had hoped for turns out to be something different. Eve had hoped for this son, this seed of hers, who would crush the head of the serpent, and instead her firstborn was a murderer. So how did she live on with her life? And what do we learn when we come against difficulties like that? Well, some react by punishing themselves. Oh, that happened because I didn't have enough faith. If I'd only had more faith, I doubted a little bit. And so people punish themselves in that way. Other people become bitter with God and they blame him, and the rest of their lives are bitter. And some people just throw the towel in. They just say, well, that's it. It doesn't work. I tried that. In the back of my Bible, I've written a wee portion. It's called Obstinate Faith. And there's so many occasions in the Bible when people, despite their circumstances, obstinately go on. And one of the classics, of course, is Job. Loses his children, loses his wealth, loses his possessions, and loses his health. And he's in a pitiful state. And yet, in his pitiful state, he still will not let go of his faith in God. And that famous statement that he says in Job chapter 13, that, yea, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. That's an obstinate faith, that despite the circumstances we're going through, that he will still trust God. John Hirkus said this: trust God even when the pieces don't fit. Trust God even when the pieces don't fit. Eve, for her, I'm sure she's thinking, well, what happened to this promised seed that was supposed to crush the head of the serpent? Maybe she, like John Hirkus, maybe she said, well, I'll still trust God. Well, certainly Job did. Job said, though he slay me. You remember the story of the young girl taken into a forced marriage, Book of Esther? You remember Esther? And there she is, and her people are going to be annihilated. And the only hope is if she goes and speaks to the king. But if you speak to the king without being summoned, your life's probably going to be forfeit. And so she makes that decision, right? She says, and those words in Esther chapter 4, well, if I perish, I perish. That obstinate faith, I will do this. Because faith, I believe in God. And you remember in the book of Daniel, Meshach and Shadrach and Abednego, and they won't bow down before the 90 feet high image of gold. And King Nebuchadnezzar says, you know, if you don't bow down, I'll throw you into the fiery furnace, and then who shall rescue you from my hand? And I just love that obstinate statement of faith that these three make. What is it they say? They say, if we are thrown into the fiery furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us from it. O King. They always were, they kept the king's place. Said, O King, but even if he does not, we want you to know, O King, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the image of gold that you have set up. I just love that statement of faith, that even if he does not. It's easy to be a Christian when things are going easy and straightforward, but sometimes you will find in your workplaces and in your life, and I'm sure many of you already have, there are times when you've just got to keep your teeth gritted and keep going. One of the most remarkable times for me is in the New Testament. The disciples, everything's going swimmingly. It's fantastic. They're following this itinerant preacher. There are crowds, thousands one day, thousands another. Everybody's listening to him. Even the Pharisees want to talk to him. The Romans are taking notice. The whole country's up. They're coming down from Galilee to hear him. They're coming from the west, from the east, from the south. And these 12 disciples, are part of this. It is so exciting. And then Jesus starts talking about you need to eat his body and drink his blood to be part of him. And people are going, what? We don't do that kind of stuff. What are you talking about? And then all this great crowds that were following him start to leave. And Jesus turns to Peter and he says to Peter, well, what about you? Will you also leave? And again, as a statement of obstinate faith, Peter says, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we believe and know that you are the Holy One of God. I'm sure Peter and the disciples said, you've destroyed the movement, Jesus. We don't know what you're doing, but we're still prepared to trust you. Anyone in Christian life, folks, who has progressed in a relationship with Christ and who have grown in strength and faith are always Christians who have had struggles, who've had to go up hills, who've had to press against the wind, who've had to go up the mountains of doubt and live in the deserts of God's silence at times. But those persevering saints always come into a stronger and higher relationship and understanding of who God is. You see, it's not how much faith you have, it's where you place that faith, isn't it? Jesus spoke about the mustard seed. It's not the size of the seed, it's where it's placed in the ground. You remember, I love that guy in Mark chapter 9, and his son's really very ill, seizures and demon possession, and he comes to Jesus. He says, oh, Jesus, if you can make my son well. And Jesus said, well, if I can, but nothing's impossible if you have faith. And the man says, oh, I know, Lord, I do believe, but help me because I also don't believe. You know, in the AV it says, Lord, I believe, help thou my unbelief. You know that statement? And it's this obstinate faith. Lord, I know you're capable, but I also have doubt. Sometimes whenever I'm speaking to young people, youth, you know, kids and that, I'll do a wee thing from the pulpit or from the front. And it's to do with faith. Maybe you've heard this before. I'll have £1, and if I'm really, really extravagant, maybe even a £2 piece, and I'll say to the children, right, who believes I've got £1 in my hand? Now, they can't see it, it's in my hand. Who believes? And if you believe, if you really believe it, you can come up and I'll give you this £1. And you get the 1 or 2 wee hands go up, so I'll pick one. And the child comes up, and I hold my hand still. I said, you really believe I've got £1 in there? Yeah, I do. Okay, well, if I'm about to destroy your faith, and everybody goes, oh, and all the parents go, and I open my hand, and there's £1. And I give the £1 to the child, and the child goes back again. And then I say to the church, now you're a bit confused, aren't you? Because I said I was going to destroy the child's faith, and yet I did have £1. That's because we sometimes think that doubt is the opposite of faith. It's not. The opposite of faith is the realization of that which you have faith in. One day we shall stand before him who has loved us and give his life for us. And that not be the time of faith then, because we will see him as he is, and we shall be changed and be like him. It won't be any faith anymore. It'll be seeing him. It'll be the reality. Faith, having to hope for that which we have not yet seen, will be gone because we will see him. And the child who took the £1 no longer needed to have faith that I had £1 in my hand. He could see it. She could see it with her own eyes. So sometimes we think that because there are doubts that sometimes go through, or like those Emmaus disciples, or we had hoped, you know, that's a destruction of faith. No, some of the greatest Christians have had times where even in doubt, they have struggled on and kept going. And young men and women, no matter what life throws at you, you hold on. As John Hurk has said, trust God even when the pieces don't fit together. Abel and Cain, that sacrifice of faith. It is curious, isn't it? I mean, why did God not accept? I mean, Abel was a farmer, so he's obviously going to bring fruit of the land, wasn't he? And that's what he did. He toiled the land, he grew stuff. Sorry, Cain was. But Abel was a shepherd. He shepherded sheep, so it would make sense that he. So why would God not be pleased with Cain and yet be pleased with Abel. It doesn't seem fair in some ways. What was it, because that Abel's sacrifice spoke of an innocent victim, the Lamb of God, and it was a picture? Well, yes, I'm sure part of it was that Abel's sacrifice was a better picture of the Messiah who would come and who would crush the head of the serpent. Or had Abel more fully grasped that sin was so costly and destructive a thing that only a sacrifice of a life would please God? And only a sacrifice, only an ultimate sacrifice would do. Well, actually, I think we sort of see the answer as we read through and we see Cain's reaction. Cain was angry. He was really upset. He fulminated it. He growled, was really cross with God. There are two aspects of our lives that I think we need to really not misunderstand of our relationship with God. Two aspects of our relationship with God that we need to keep right. Number one, the majesty and the grandeur and the supremacy and the sovereignty of God. That sometimes just to sit and be still and to think who God is, how magisterial he is, how amazingly beyond our imagination he is, how perfect he is. And the second thing in our relationship with God we need to keep in mind is our utter brokenness because of sin. That we are sinners to the very depth of our being. That these hands of mine are capable of the darkest of human sins. That I am a sinner and I'm not worthy of coming before this God. I don't think Cain had got that. I think Cain was of an attitude, you know what? If I bring a sacrifice, well, now God, you've got to do your bit. I've done my bit, so you do your bit, which is to bless me. I mean, I don't, that's the way it works. And Cain was almost haggling with God about that. He could not, he was angry because God didn't accept the sacrifice. Hebrews tells us in chapter 4 of Hebrews, I'll just read it there. Chapter 11, sorry, verse 4, that by faith Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith he still speaks even though he is dead. It was by faith. Now what's the difference? It doesn't say that Cain gave his sacrifice in faith. He just brought some first fruits. As I say, I think because of his reaction, it's pretty evident that Cain was disappointed in God's side of how he reacted to his gift, whereas Abel's was one in faith. In other words, he wasn't expecting back from God. It was an act of faith, of trust, of I will give my very best for God, and what God does with that is up to him. Getting a picture of God. How am I doing for time? I think I've got a wee bit. Yeah, are we okay for it? Where am I doing all right? Where's can't see if I can find anybody. There's Adam. Am I all right? Anyway, I presume I have another few minutes. Back in 1995, there was a guy called Bob Williams. He was the head of the Hubble telescope. And he came out with a crazy thing. He said, for 100 hours, let's point the Hubble telescope at a piece of the sky that has apparently no stars in it and see what we can find. Now, some of them said that it was crazy because every minute cost money for the Hubble telescope to point it anywhere. But because he was the chief of the Hubble telescope science team, he was allowed 100 hours a month. And so they pointed it for 100 hours at the handle of the plow at a piece of sky, a 30th of the diameter of the moon. Now, how does that work? If you put your hands up to the sky and try to catch the moon, as it were, with your finger and thumb, it's about 5 millimeters from That's what it'll be. Put your arm out at arm's length. A 30th of that is 0.16 of a millimeter. In other words, I can't even hold my fingers that close together because I'll probably touch. That's the tiny bit of sky. It would be like a pinprick of darkness. And in that pinprick of darkness, they were astounded what they found. They found within that one pinprick that they looked at, never seen before, 3,000 new stars. No, not 3,000 new stars, 3,000 unseen galaxies. Now, bear in mind, our galaxy has 100 billion stars in it. In this one pinprick of darkness, the Hubble telescope picked out another 3,000 galaxies. Now, they've since, that's called the Hubble Deep Field. They've since done a Hubble Ultra Deep Field. They've held it there for much longer, and they've multiplied that by 100-fold the amount of galaxies they found in that pinprick, and the universe filled with it. The heavens declare the glory of God. And you know what? The stars are just the work of his fingers. And this great God, this magisterial God, I don't think Cain got it, but I think Abel had. And if we could get that, if we know that we don't deserve this, you know, whenever John was writing in his epistle, he wrote this, he said, how great is the love the Father has lavished upon us that we should be called the children of God. And that is what we are. It's like John saying, how could God make us his children? People like me, sinners and broken, how can God have a place for me? And yet he does. That God who put those universes, those galaxies into place, you matter to him. Your life, every moment of your life, every hair on your head, all of your future, how long or short that'll be, the people you interact with, the people you'll know, the thoughts you have, you matter to him. You matter so much that he gave up the author of all of that, his son, so that you could enjoy him in that universe of his. I just think it's astounding. Anyway, I'm going on a bit. I need to try and get finished. Can I just finish by saying this? The wonderful liberty of faith is this, and I think Abel probably found it actually. You don't find a big conversation with Abel and God, and Abel saying, well, was that all right? How does that go? Should I have brushed the lamb first? Should I have washed it better? Should I have cleaned its teeth, used Colgate? What should I? No, Abel's not involved in any real conversation that way. Cain is, he's embittered. And the sense is of a sense of liberty. Abel did the best he could, and by faith trusted in what God's reaction would be. And you know, you're all very high attainers. The fact that at university and the degrees you're doing, you've worked hard to get where you are. And that's marvelous, very creditable. And you'll go on to some of you, many of you teaching children, and others going into other work, and God bless you. But don't make that performance that you've had to strain for. Don't think that that works out in your faith. God doesn't mark you as your to performance. It's not a performance-driven faith. It's a childlike faith. You know, you don't to please your parents. Like he doesn't give your parents don't give you a wee list of things that once you do that they'll be pleased with you. You know, and then you'll be my child. Your parents love you unconditionally. People who love you unconditionally. God loves you unconditionally. He's not looking for performance from you. He's just looking that you will trust him. And that even when it gets tough at times, even when, like Eve, things didn't work out the way you'd hoped, even when, like Peter, you know, everybody's leaving, even when you have those times where you lose your health, you lose different things in life, but you're determined still to follow Jesus Christ, then you will really be getting to know Jesus Christ. Then you'll really be walking with him. And it's tremendously liberating. Let me just finish by a verse in Corinthians, because what's ahead of us? In this simple trust, we, just as simple sinners, and trusting Jesus Christ, the maker of the universe, do you know what he's promised us? No eye has seen, no ear has heard, nor has it entered into the heart of man what God has prepared for those who love him. You know, keep that hope in your hearts. Go out some night, look at the stars. Your daddy, Abba, Father, your Father made that just to let you know how big he is and how much he loves you. God bless you, each and every one. Sorry if I've gone over time. I should have noted what time we started at. But God bless you, and walk in faith, and walk to please him, and walk in the liberty and the knowledge that he loves you deeply.
Thank you so much, Ivan. That was just brilliant. Such a great encouragement for us. And thank you so much. And apologies for my screen freezing out before you started there, but it's good you took the initiative and just went for it. So